There are cases in my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes so strange, so touched by whispers of the infernal, that even I hesitated before setting pen to paper. Yet truth demands its telling. It was in those dim years between our greatest victories and darker trials yet to come, when the fog of London lay thick upon Baker Street, that a summons reached us, bearing with it the shadow of death, superstition, and a manuscript whispered to be written by a servant of the devil himself. What followed drew Holmes and me into a house where corridors echoed with unseen hooves, where writing glimmered faintly upon ancient vellum, and where fear itself had been turned into a weapon. This is the tale I have long kept locked away, Sherlock Holmes and the adventure of the devil's manuscript. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing to the channel and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Letter with the Blackened Edge. It was upon a mild morning in late November, when the fog had lifted from Baker Street to reveal one of those deceptive days of winter sunlight, that our doorbell rang with a peculiar, hesitant insistence. Holmes had been engaged in reaching for a folio of early Venetian poison trials from the topmost shelf of our bookcase, balanced precariously upon a chair with that casual disregard for personal safety which marked so many of his scholarly pursuits. He stepped down with feline grace, his long fingers grey with accumulated dust, and tossed the ancient pamphlet onto our already cluttered table. "Your patient, Watson, or mine?" he inquired, tilting his sharp profile towards the sound of uncertain footsteps ascending our 17 stairs. "Yours, I fear," said I, recognizing in the halting tread and the tentative knock that followed upon our inner door the unmistakable signs of one who half expects rebuff before even presenting their case. Our visitor proved to be a young lady of perhaps 25 years, possessed of that earnest countenance which speaks of good breeding tempered by recent tribulation. Her features, though refined, were marked by the telltale shadows of sleepless nights, and she wore a plain travelling suit whose hem bore the dark stains of November mud from country roads. In one black-gloved hand she carried a letter whose edges appeared to have been dipped in ink of the deepest hue, creating a border of mourning around the cream-laid paper. She curtsied with old-fashioned grace and introduced herself as Miss Esther Ashwood of Ashwood Hall in Sussex, her voice carrying that particular strain which comes from the effort to maintain composure in the face of inexplicable terror. "What you observe upon this correspondence, gentlemen," said she, placing the letter upon our table with the delicacy of one handling a venomous serpent, "is what I beseech you to deliver me from." My uncle perished beside such a missive as this. Our librarian has nearly followed him into madness. The village folk whisper that it bears the devil's own curse. Holmes's grey eyes kindled with that peculiar light which always heralded his interest in the unusual, and he drew the letter close to his powerful lens, studying the blackened edges with the absorbed attention of a naturalist examining some exotic specimen. "Not ink," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "A silver compound, I believe. Nitrate, most likely. It darkens when exposed to light. Curious to frame the entire perimeter in such a substance, like mourning borders for correspondence. Pray continue, Miss Ashwood. The circumstances surrounding these afflictions will prove, I suspect, more illuminating than the phenomenon itself." Miss Ashwood composed herself and began her narrative in a voice that strove for steadiness despite the tremor that betrayed her inner turmoil. Sir Benedict Ashwood, her uncle and guardian, had been a gentleman of scholarly pursuits, a noted antiquary and collector whose reputation extended throughout the learned circles of England and the continent. His most recent acquisition, obtained from a London bookseller named Josiah Cribb, was a 13th century illuminated manuscript recovered from a dissolved monastery somewhere on the Sussex Weald. The volume was bound in brown calf leather of considerable age, its covers stamped with the image of a horned mask that had immediately caught the superstitious attention of the household staff. The village gossips, with that talent for melodrama which characterizes rural communities, had promptly christened it the Devil's Manuscript, though Sir Benedict had dismissed such foolishness as the product of ignorant minds incapable of appreciating scholarly treasures. Yet the Latin marginalia, Miss Ashwood continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, possessed an ill sound even to my uncle's educated ear. The morning after he first sat down to study the volume in earnest, he was discovered at dawn collapsed at his reading desk in the library. His right hand bore a stain black as charcoal, his face was grey as ash, and though no servant confessed to the act, the window had been set ajar during the night. Dr. Milverton, the family physician, had pronounced the cause to be a seizure brought on by Sir Benedict's advancing years and his habit of scholarly overexertion. Yet scarcely a week later, Mr. Peregrine Vale, the estate's librarian, the gentlest and most learned of men, as Miss Ashwood described him, had been found in similar circumstances after spending an evening with the accursed volume. Though Vale had survived the ordeal, his mind appeared to have suffered some profound shock, for he spoke in wild fragments of hoofed creatures stalking the corridors and of fires that burned with an unholy green flame. Most disturbing of all, she continued, pressing her handkerchief to her lips as if to prevent some dreadful confession from escaping. On the night of Mr. Vale's collapse, the housekeeper discovered prints in the dust outside the library door, marks that resembled nothing so much as the cloven hooves of some infernal beast. By morning, Professor Mortlake, a visiting scholar, swore upon his honour that he had witnessed a line of writing upon the open manuscript page glow with its own eldritch light. Holmes, I protested, unable to contain my professional skepticism. Surely this is nothing more than village hysteria compounded by coincidence and the natural tendency of frightened minds to perceive supernatural agency where none exists. My friend's thin lips curved in that enigmatic smile which I had learned to associate with cases of unusual complexity. Is it indeed, Watson? And if it be hysteria, we must ask ourselves the eternal question. Cui bono? Who profits from such collective delusion? He turned his penetrating gaze upon our client. Tell me, Miss Ashwood, who stands to inherit Ashwood Hall should your uncle's will remain unchanged? A shadow crossed her features. My cousin Julian Ashwood, my uncle's nephew by his deceased brother, unless there should prove to be some later codicil. Uncle Benedict had spoken in recent weeks of revising his testament in my favour, though he had grown strangely secretive about his affairs, forever locking doors and testing keys as if he feared some manner of intrusion. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and I recognized the posture that preceded his most incisive deductions. The household, I presume, is not entirely harmonious in its response to these mysterious events? Indeed not, Mr. Holmes. We seem pulled in a dozen directions at once. Graves, our butler, is a man of sombre disposition who regards all scholarly pursuits with suspicion and openly disapproves of the parade of academics who visit my uncle's library. The Reverend Swithin Chartham, our curate, denounces the manuscript as a snare of Satan and urges that it be committed to the flames without delay. Professor Mortlake presses constantly for greater access to the volume for his research, claiming it contains unique examples of medieval illumination. And Mr. Cribb, the bookseller, haunts our premises like a carrion bird, making repeated offers to repurchase the manuscript at prices that seem to increase with each visitation. She paused, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of her isolation. I find myself alone in the midst of their competing urgencies, Mr. Holmes, with no one to trust and nowhere to turn. The very walls of Ashwood Hall seem to press closer each day, as if the house itself were holding its breath in anticipation of some terrible climax. Holmes rose from his chair with the fluid motion that characterized his moments of decision. "We shall take the afternoon train to Sussex," he announced, his voice carrying that note of quiet authority which brooked no contradiction. "Meanwhile, Watson, be so good as to pack my lens, the small chemical case, and, yes, the theatrical box containing my various disguises. There is indeed a distinct scent to this affair, Miss Ashwood, but I venture to suggest it emanates not from the sulphurous depths of the inferno, but from more terrestrial sources entirely." The confidence in his tone seemed to infuse our client with renewed hope. She rose, expressing her gratitude with the relief of one who has been drowning, and suddenly spies a rope thrown from shore. After she had departed, Holmes returned to his examination of the blackened letter, turning it this way and that in the pale November light until the dark border shone with an almost metallic luster. "Superstition, Watson," said he, speaking more to himself than to me, "is a ladder upon which some men climb to power while others are pushed to their destruction. Let us discover which fate awaits our mysterious manuscript and those who would possess it." With that characteristically cryptic observation, we began our preparations for the journey to Sussex, though I confess the case had already begun to shape itself in my friend's remarkable mind with a precision that I had learned to fear as much as admire. For when Holmes spoke of scents and ladders, of profit hidden behind apparent hysteria, I knew we were embarking upon one of those investigations that would test not only our powers of deduction, but our understanding of the darkness that lurks within the human heart itself. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Ashwood Hall. The afternoon train bore us through the rolling Sussex countryside, where the November landscape stretched beneath a sky the colour of pewter, and bare trees etched their skeletal forms against fields brown with winter stubble. Ashwood Hall rose from this austere setting like something conjured from a medieval romance, a broad, low manor house of mellow brick, its facade warmed by ancient ivy and crowned by twisted chimney stacks that spoke of centuries of continuous habitation. The building commanded a natural shelf among the downs, with a park of copper beeches spreading behind it like a fan, their leafless branches creating intricate patterns against the lowering sky. A flight of stone steps led to the main entrance, flanked by leaded windows that caught what little light the afternoon afforded, and reflected it back with the dull gleam of old silver. We were received at the door by Graves, the butler, a gaunt figure whose sallow complexion and deep-set eyes gave him the appearance of some medieval penitent. His manner was correct but cold, and I detected in his bearing that peculiar stiffness which often characterizes servants who have appointed themselves guardians of their employer's dignity against the intrusions of an unworthy world. Miss Ashwood met us in the great hall and conducted us immediately to the library, her voice dropping to hushed tones as if the very oak panelling might possess ears to overhear our conversation. The chamber proved to be a noble apartment in the ecclesiastical style, long and chapel-like, with lancet windows at the far end that admitted the grey afternoon light in dusty shafts. A reading desk stood beneath these windows, its surface illuminated by a brass lamp whose green shade cast a pool of emerald radiance across the leather-bound volumes scattered upon the desktop. Holmes's keen gaze travelled across the scene with the systematic precision of a general surveying a battlefield, taking in every detail. The patterns worn into the Turkey carpet by generations of scholarly pacing, the faint scuffs upon the polished floorboards where chairs had been moved and replaced, the curious way the brass fittings of the reading lamp seemed somehow thicker around the wick than one might normally expect. Upon the eastern wall hung a modern barometer, its brass case gleaming in the lamplight, while beneath it sat a leather armchair whose right arm bore the unmistakable circular burn mark left by a carelessly placed pipe or cigar. Upon the reading desk itself, arranged with the reverent precision of a religious altar, lay the object that had brought us to this remote corner of Sussex, the Devil's Manuscript. The volume was indeed impressive, its brown calf binding showing the patina of great age, while the covers bore the stamped impression of a horned mask whose hollow eyes seemed to follow one's movement about the room. The brass clasps that secured it gleamed with recent polishing, though I noticed that the leather binding showed signs of having been recently disturbed and re-stitched. Holmes approached the desk with the measured tread of one entering a shrine, yet he did not immediately touch the manuscript. Instead, he bent low over the surface, examining with his magnifying lens several drops of hardened wax that had fallen beside the volume. "Beeswax rather than tallow," he murmured, straightening slightly, "and curiously flecked with particles of a black dust. Lamp soot, one might assume, yet the residue appears more consistent with phosphorus. Watson, your medical nose, if you please." I leaned forward and detected beneath the familiar scents of old leather and paper a faint but unmistakable sweetness, reminiscent of overripe fruit. "Chloroform?" I ventured. "Perhaps," Holmes replied thoughtfully, "or some closely related compound. We shall see what further investigation reveals." We were then introduced to the other members of the household, each of whom seemed to regard us with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and hope. Professor Mortlake proved to be a sharp-featured gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with a carefully trimmed beard and the intense manner of one accustomed to academic debate. His bow was perhaps too elaborate, and I detected in his eyes that peculiar gleam which often characterizes the scholar who sees in every ancient text a potential pathway to professional advancement. Julian Ashwood, the heir presumptive, presented a striking contrast to the earnest academics who populated his uncle's library. Handsome in a careless fashion that spoke of good breeding and insufficient purpose, he wore his expensive clothing with the casual elegance of one to whom financial concerns were either unknown or studiously ignored. Yet I observed that his cufflinks, while fashionable, bore the telltale scratches that suggested recent acquaintance with a pawnbroker's establishment. The Reverend Swithin Chartham was a thin, ascetic gentleman whose pale fingers clutched his prayer book as if it were a weapon against the forces of darkness he perceived gathering around the cursed manuscript. His eyes burned with the fervour of one who had appointed himself heaven's advocate in a contest between good and evil, though I detected beneath his righteous indignation a note of genuine fear. Mrs. Hester Lane, the housekeeper, commanded attention through sheer force of personality. A woman of middle years, whose ample figure and direct gaze spoke of decades spent managing the practical affairs of a great household. Though heavy with dignity, she moved with surprising lightness, and her keen eyes missed nothing that occurred within her domain. Professor Mortlake dominated the initial conversation, speaking with rapid enthusiasm of codices and monastic hands, of illuminated capitals, and the peculiarities of medieval Latin. He had, he declared with obvious pride, identified the marginalia as the work of a 13th-century scribe whose nickname, Scriptor Diabole, had become attached to any manuscript bearing his distinctive, decorative flourishes. Julian laughed at the notion of supernatural curses with the easy confidence of youth, though in the next breath he urged Miss Ashwood to dispose of the manuscript immediately, hinting that Ashwood Hall's financial situation was more precarious than family pride might care to acknowledge. The Reverend Swithin countered with passionate arguments for the volume's immediate destruction, whilst Mrs. Lane, with the practical wisdom of her station, suggested that perhaps the gentlemen might benefit from tea and sustenance before pursuing their theological debates. Holmes listened to these exchanges with apparent passivity, asking few direct questions while allowing the various personalities to reveal themselves through their own words and actions. Yet I observed him examining minutely the brass fittings of the reading lamp, retrieving from the mantelpiece a length of peculiar cord that had somehow found its way there. London stationer's twine, he noted quietly, and studying with professional interest the hoof-prints that had been carefully preserved in a tray of dust near the library door. The prints were indeed remarkable, deep, perfectly symmetrical impressions that bore an uncanny resemblance to the cloven hooves of some large ungulate. Yet Holmes's examination seemed to amuse rather than alarm him, and he passed on without comment to other aspects of his investigation. We were shown the precise location where Sir Benedict had been discovered, and Holmes knelt beside the reading desk, his long fingers testing the floorboards with the delicacy of a pianist exploring an unfamiliar keyboard. He placed a single hair across a crack in the oak and watched intently for any sign of air movement, examined the window catch and the brass barometer with equal attention, and spent long minutes studying the lamp's oil reservoir and the curious thickening of the brass sleeve around the wick. "I should like to interview Mr. Vale, the librarian," Holmes announced at last. Miss Ashwood's expression grew troubled. "His mind has wandered considerably since the shock," she whispered. "Mrs. Lane tends to him in the Rose Room, where the southern exposure provides the most cheerful light. Perhaps the brightness helps to dispel whatever shadows have gathered in his thoughts. We found the poor gentleman in a pitiable condition, his once robust frame reduced to trembling frailty, his hair gone prematurely white, and his right hand still bearing the dark stains that had appeared after his encounter with the manuscript. When Holmes drew back the curtains to admit the full force of the afternoon sunlight, the marks upon Vale's fingers seemed to deepen and darken before our very eyes, transforming from brown to an ominous black that made the man whimper and shrink back into his chair. Holmes soothed the frightened librarian with gentle words and asked no questions of any significance, but I observed him carefully collecting a tiny scraping of the stained skin upon the blade of his penknife. "With your permission, Miss Ashwood," he said, as we prepared to leave the afflicted man to his rest, "I shall conduct certain tests this evening. One or two further observations, and I believe the devil's handwriting will prove remarkably legible indeed." As darkness settled over Ashwood Hall and the lamps were lit throughout the ancient rooms, I found myself experiencing that peculiar mixture of skepticism and unease which had characterized so many of our investigations into the apparently supernatural. The hoofprints in the dust, the glowing manuscript, the mysterious stains that darkened in sunlight. Each element seemed designed to convince the credulous that infernal forces had taken residence within these scholarly walls. Yet Holmes's confidence remained unshaken, and as I observed him making his preparations for whatever nocturnal experiments he had planned, I reflected once again upon his remarkable ability to perceive the rational explanations that lurked beneath even the most mystifying circumstances. The devil, I suspected, would prove to be a very human adversary indeed, though perhaps no less dangerous for being mortal. Chapter 3. Masks and Mechanisms. Holmes rose before dawn and departed the hall without explanation, leaving me to wonder at his purpose during the long morning hours that followed. He had tasked me with a singular errand, a journey to the market town of Chichester to make inquiries of one Tobias Hobbs, a farrier whose workshop lay in a narrow lane behind the cathedral close. My mission proved both illuminating and disturbing. Hobbs, a stout gentleman with the powerful forearms of his trade, readily confirmed that a customer answering Julian Ashwood's precise description had commissioned a most unusual piece of ironwork some 2 weeks prior. A curious device consisting of 2 split semicircles that, when placed alternately upon the ground, would leave impressions remarkably similar to the cloven hooves of some large beast. "Said it were for a harvest masquerade, he did," Hobbs explained, wiping his hands upon his leather apron. "Paid with this here ring, though he seemed reluctant to part with it." The farrier produced a pawn ticket bearing Julian's name and the description of a gold signet ring set with garnets, jewelry far too valuable to surrender for a theatrical prop unless the owner's circumstances were indeed desperate. Upon my return to Ashwood Hall, I discovered that Holmes had undergone one of his remarkable transformations. He had become, through the subtle alchemy of his theatrical arts, one Dr. Heinrich von Alten, a distinguished German paleographer whose narrow head, blue-tinted spectacles, and carefully cultivated accent would have deceived his own mother. The metamorphosis was so complete that I found myself addressing him with the formal courtesy due to a distinguished foreign scholar. His morning's work, I learned, had been spent in the taproom of the village inn, where he had cultivated the acquaintance of both Josiah Cribb, the London bookseller, and a journeyman bookbinder lately in Cribb's employ. From these gentlemen he had extracted a most revealing account of the manuscript's recent history, an account deliberately vague in certain crucial particulars, yet specific enough to confirm Holmes's growing suspicions. The binding was disturbed last month and resewn by London hands, he informed me in his assumed German accent, taking evident pleasure in the deception. The devil, mine friend, does not employ needle and thread, but a lawyer's clerk, a conspirator, or an anxious testator most certainly might. That evening, Miss Ashwood gathered courage to host a small assembly in the library, hoping that the presence of rational minds might dispel the atmosphere of supernatural dread that had settled over the household. The scene that greeted us was worthy of a Gothic novelist's imagination. Shadows dancing in the lamplight, ancient books looming from their shelves like silent witnesses, and the accursed manuscript lying open upon its desk like some malevolent altar awaiting sacrifice. Professor Mortlake, barely able to contain his scholarly excitement, arranged his papers and writing materials with the reverent precision of a priest preparing for Mass. The Reverend Swithin stationed himself in the doorway, as if prepared to ward off demonic manifestation through sheer force of will. Julian lounged with studied casualness, though I noticed his smile required considerable effort to maintain its appearance of nonchalant amusement. Mrs. Lane kept to the shadows near the hearth, her watchful eyes missing nothing, while Graves hovered at the periphery of the gathering like a black cloud pregnant with disapproval. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation as the various personalities arranged themselves around the central mystery of the devil's manuscript. Holmes, still maintaining his Germanic persona, made seemingly casual inquiries about the reading lamp, that curious fixture whose brass throat appeared somehow swollen around the wick. Mrs. Lane confirmed that it was indeed a recent acquisition, purchased to replace an older lamp that had produced excessive smoke and proved unsatisfactory for close scholarly work. "This new one burns much cooler," she observed, though Holmes's sensitive fingers, exploring the brass fittings, discovered a tiny adjustment mechanism that no ordinary reading lamp would require. He knelt beside the desk, inhaling deeply, then suppressed a slight cough that spoke of irritation to his delicate respiratory system. "Watson," he murmured, when I drew near to inquire after his health, "do you detect that peculiar sweetness in the air? Not quite chloroform, not quite ether, perhaps chloral hydrate, or some related compound introduced through a porous medium. Observe also how the brass sleeve has been thickened to accommodate additional mechanisms. A tube from the lamp's interior could easily pass down here, terminating beneath the reader's position, and deliver a carefully measured dose of soporific vapor to anyone seated at this desk." The implications struck me with the force of revelation. The fainting spells, the visions, precisely. A touch of phosphorus mixed into the wax would create the illusion of supernatural writing, particularly to a mind already influenced by narcotic substances. In such a state, a man might easily mistake his own hallucinations for diabolic manifestations. And the blackened fingers. Holmes's eyes glittered with satisfaction behind his blue spectacles. "Silver nitrate, my dear fellow, applied to the skin while the victim lay unconscious. Touch, light, darken. A most convenient method for creating apparent stigmata that would appear hours after the perpetrator had departed the scene." Professor Mortlake now claimed the place of honor at the reading desk, adjusting his own spectacles and raising the lamp's green shade to flood the ancient pages with emerald radiance. The manuscript seemed to glow with the seductive beauty of illuminated vellum, and Mortlake's voice took on the reverent tones of one communing with the wisdom of ages. "Observe here, Herr Doctor," he addressed Holmes in his assumed identity. "The remarkable quality of the marginal decorations vied this rubric, the work of the scriptor Diaboli himself, and this miniature of extraordinary delicacy. Ah!" Even as he spoke, a faint phosphorescence began to trace along the lower margin of the page, as if some ghostly hand were inscribing words in letters of pale fire. The effect was achieved, I realized, by a draught from the window that Graves had opened at precisely that moment. A current of air that excited the phosphorus paste concealed within the manuscript's binding. A collective gasp arose from the assembled company. The Reverend Swithin crossed himself with trembling fingers, while Professor Mortlake grew pale and swayed in his chair, whether from supernatural terror or the effects of whatever narcotic was emanating from the cunningly altered lamp. Holmes moved with the fluid precision of a striking serpent. His long arm shot beneath the reading desk and tore free a slender india-rubber tube that had been artfully concealed along the desktop's underside. He pinched the device, inhaled its contents, and tossed it to me with a gesture of triumph. The scent was indeed sweet and cloying, with the unmistakable character of chloral hydrate. Next, he struck the lamp's burner from its brass housing and, with delicate but determined force, extracted a small metal sleeve from within the thickened throat of the fixture. The device was hollow, perforated with minute holes, and stained with the residue of whatever chemical compounds had passed through it. Finally, he produced from some hidden recess a dark bladder of india-rubber, complete with a tiny valve mechanism. He arranged these three objects upon the reading desk with the theatrical precision of a conjurer revealing his apparatus. "There, meine Damen und Herren," he announced in his assumed German accent, "we have successfully gagged your devil." The atmosphere of the room transformed instantaneously, as if some malevolent presence had indeed been banished by the simple act of exposing the mechanical contrivances that had created its apparent manifestations. Professor Mortlake collapsed into his chair, overcome not by narcotic influence, but by the crushing realization that his scholarly fears had been manipulated by entirely human agency. Julian Ashwood forced a laugh and dismissed the entire affair as a rather elaborate house trick that has been carried too far, though his voice carried a note of strain that suggested deeper concerns. The Reverend Swithin closed his prayer book with an expression more of sorrow than triumph, as if he had hoped for a clearer victory of good over evil than this mere exposure of mechanical deception. Holmes, his wig still perfectly arranged and his German accent intact, bowed formally to Miss Ashwood. "If you would permit me, gnädiges Fräulein, to spend 1 hour alone with this manuscript, I believe I can provide you with the answers your heart seeks before the next chime of the clock." The hour that followed tested the patience of all concerned, though none more severely than Miss Ashwood herself, who paced the drawing-room like a caged creature while we awaited Holmes's conclusions. When he finally emerged from the library, his own familiar features once again restored to their accustomed place, his expression bore that look of grim satisfaction which I had learned to associate with the successful resolution of his most complex cases. "The devil, it appears, writes a remarkably legible hand," he announced, "though the writing we most urgently require is not to be found upon the manuscript's pages, but rather within its binding itself." With those cryptic words, he left us to ponder what revelations the dawn might bring, while outside Ashwood Hall the November wind moaned through the eaves like the voices of all the accumulated secrets that these ancient walls had witnessed through their centuries of silent observation. Chapter 4. The Secret in the Binding. The morning brought with it a clarity of purpose that seemed to banish the Gothic mysteries of the previous evening, like fog dissipating before the sun's rays. Holmes had requested that a small fire be kindled in the library grate, along with the attendance of Mrs. Lane, Graves the butler, and Julian Ashwood. Professor Mortlake, still shaken by his exposure to the manufactured supernatural phenomena, had begged leave to retire to his chambers, while the Reverend Swithin had taken it upon himself to escort the bewildered librarian Vale to the Rose Room, where the morning light might help dispel whatever shadows continued to haunt the poor man's troubled mind. Thus, the stage was set with only those players whose roles in the unfolding drama were most essential to its resolution. "Mrs. Lane," Holmes began, settling into the chair by the fireplace with the air of a judge preparing to hear testimony. "You have managed the affairs of this household for how many years?" 18 years come Michaelmas, sir," she replied, with the dignity of one whose service had earned her a position of respect and trust. "Then you would be well positioned to know whether Sir Benedict received, within the last month, any correspondence from a London solicitor, and whether he took unusual pains to keep such communication secret even from his most trusted servants." Mrs. Lane's composed features worked with some internal struggle before she answered. "He did receive such a packet, Mr. Holmes, and he did indeed guard its contents with most unusual secretiveness. I saw him sewing something into the devil's book with his own hands. His eyesight had begun to fail, you understand, and he required my assistance to thread the needle. But when I inquired as to his purpose, he would say only, 'Hester, if I should drop dead where I sit, lock this room immediately and summon Mr. Vale alone.' It was most unlike his usual frank manner with me." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "And after Sir Benedict's death, someone took the trouble to undo his handiwork." I observed Graves start slightly at these words, while Julian Ashwood shifted in his chair with barely concealed agitation. The net that Holmes had been weaving with such patient skill was beginning to tighten around its quarry. "Watson," Holmes continued, extending his hand toward me, "your penknife, if you please. And perhaps Mrs. Lane would be so kind as to bring the crystal decanter of water from the sideboard." With the reverent care of a surgeon approaching a delicate operation, Holmes laid the devil's manuscript upon a clean cloth and began to examine its binding with his magnifying lens. Near the center of the spine, where the leather showed signs of recent disturbance, he located a line of stitches that were both finer and newer than the original medieval craftsmanship. "The thread here is of modern manufacture," he observed, testing its strength with gentle pressure. "Continental silk, I should judge, and dyed with aniline rather than natural substances. Most revealing." With infinite delicacy, he inserted the blade of my penknife beneath the newer stitching, working each loop free with the patience of an archaeologist uncovering some precious relic. As the last thread parted, the leather binding separated slightly, revealing within the hollow spine a thin packet wrapped in oiled paper and sealed with red wax, bearing the unmistakable impression of Sir Benedict's personal crest. The packet was addressed in that clear, old-fashioned hand that I recognized from the musical manuscripts scattered about the library. codicil to my last will and testament." Miss Ashwood gave a sharp cry of recognition, while Julian's face drained of colour. Mrs. Lane pressed her hand to her throat, and even the stoic Graves seemed shaken by this revelation of his late master's final intentions. Holmes held the packet toward Miss Ashwood, but did not break the seal. "I believe your uncle intended this document for your eyes, my dear young lady, though the law must be served in its proper forms before any testament can be considered valid." Before her trembling fingers could accept the packet, Julian Ashwood half rose from his chair with a muttered oath, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the pressure of seeing his expectations crumble before his eyes. The movement spoke volumes about the desperation that had driven him to such elaborate deceptions in pursuit of an inheritance that was never rightfully his. Holmes pocketed the codicil with gentle firmness. "Not yet, Miss Ashwood. Legal proprieties must be observed, and there are officers of the law who will require this evidence in its pristine condition. But now we may speak plainly of the mechanisms by which this household has been terrorized." He retrieved from the mantelpiece the apparatus he had discovered the previous evening: the hollow lamp sleeve, the rubber tube, and the small bladder that had contained the narcotic compounds. These devices were installed within the past fortnight by someone with intimate knowledge of the library's arrangements and unlimited access to its fixtures. The silver nitrate and phosphorus paste were mere theatrical flourishes, designed to lend credence to supernatural explanations. But the soporific gas was the crucial element. It would render a reader unconscious while filling his mind with vivid hallucinations, and most importantly, it would enable a searcher to examine both the victim and the premises while the poor fellow lay helpless. Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon Graves, whose sallow complexion had grown even more pallid. "Your hands, my good man, carry the distinctive odours of paraffin and printer's ink. You have been polishing that lamp's brass throat as if it were your own guilty conscience." The butler drew himself up with wounded dignity. "Sir, I will not stand accused of wrongdoing in my master's house." "Nor shall you be," Holmes interrupted gently. "You are not the architect of this deception, but merely its instrument. Your true master, since Sir Benedict's death, has been the strongest will remaining at Ashwood Hall, not Miss Ashwood, who is too honest for such stratagems, not Mrs. Lane, who is too loyal to betray her trust, not the Reverend Swithin, who is too gentle for such machinations, not Professor Mortlake, who is strong in scholarship, but weak in practical villainy. Mr. Julian Ashwood has been your commander in this enterprise, and the elaborate mechanism was installed at his express direction." Julian's mask of casual indifference finally slipped entirely. "You prove too much, Holmes," he said, with a sneer that transformed his handsome features into something far less attractive. "If I had wished the old man harm, why not simply arrange a more direct accident? Why this elaborate charade? Because you had not yet decided whether to destroy or secure what your uncle had hidden. You knew, through careless words from the London bookbinder, through hints dropped by the acquisitive Mr. Cribb, that the manuscript had been opened and re-sewn to conceal something of value. You suspected a codicil, a new will, or perhaps instructions to some banker regarding the disposition of the estate. To discover its location, you required either the room to yourself for extended periods or the ability to stupefy anyone who sat there while you searched. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his sharp profile silhouetted against the grey November sky. You commissioned the theatrical props from Hobbs the farrier, paying with your own signet ring when ready money failed you. You obtained the stationer's twine during a recent visit to London, along with the chemical compounds necessary for your ghost show. You instructed Graves to adjust the window catch to provide the draught necessary for your phosphorescent effects, and you scattered about the library those supposedly supernatural evidences that would frighten the servants away from the scene of your investigations. Julian's eyes glittered with desperate malice. All clever conjecture, Holmes, but you lack the one element essential to any legal proceeding, a clear motive that would drive a gentleman to such extremes. Holmes's smile was thin as winter sunlight. Your debts with Lord Ravelstoke's gaming establishment provide motive enough. The pawn ticket at Hobbs's forge confirms your immediate financial distress. Your recent hurried journey to London coincides precisely with Mr. Cribb's missed appointment to examine the manuscript, an appointment you deliberately disrupted to prevent any professional assessment of what your uncle had concealed within the binding. He gestured toward Julian's expensive cufflinks, their gold surfaces marred by telltale scratches. Your very jewellery proclaims your circumstances, Mr. Ashwood. Those marks speak of repeated visits to establishments where gentlemen pledge their patrimony against temporary relief from their creditors. Julian's composure finally shattered completely. He turned upon Graves with savage fury. "You bungling fool! I told you to ensure that the mechanism remained undetectable." "Enough!" Holmes interrupted with quiet authority. "Watson, perhaps you would be so good as to summon the local constable." But first, he moved to the reading desk and moistened his finger with water from the crystal decanter, then touched the dampened digit to the edge of the manuscript's page. When he held his hand to the morning light streaming through the windows, the finger darkened immediately to a deep brown stain. "Silver nitrate, precisely as I suspected," he observed with professional satisfaction. "Most useful for creating the illusion of supernatural stigmata upon the skin of an unconscious victim, though rather painful when the solution is concentrated enough to produce lasting marks." Julian's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I did not murder him," he muttered, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured bladder. Holmes regarded him with that mixture of pity and contempt he reserved for criminals whose ambitions had exceeded their moral courage. "Perhaps not in the legal sense, Mr. Ashwood. But you gambled recklessly with the life of a frail old man whose only crime was loving his niece more than his nephew. You deliberately induced terror and confusion in hopes of gaining access to his secrets while he lay helpless. That his weak heart could not bear the strain of your manufactured horrors is a consequence you must face, whether or not a jury ultimately deems it murder." The sound of official footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Inspector Bradshaw of the County Constabulary, summoned by Holmes's earlier message. The inspector, a stout gentleman with the methodical manner of one accustomed to rural crimes of passion rather than elaborate frauds, listened with growing amazement as Holmes laid out the complete chain of evidence. Julian Ashwood was led away in handcuffs, his protestations of innocence ringing hollow against the accumulated weight of mechanical contrivances, chemical evidence, and financial desperation. Graves, whose loyalty had been perverted to serve criminal ends, followed his corrupted master into custody, though Holmes had already indicated his intention to speak favourably regarding the butler's previous character when the case came to trial. Chapter 5. The Restoration of Ashwood Hall. 3 days later, when the legal formalities had been properly observed, and Sir Benedict's codicil had been opened in the presence of appropriate witnesses, Miss Esther Ashwood found herself confirmed as the rightful inheritor of Ashwood Hall, with generous provisions made for Mrs. Lane's continued service and Mr. Vale's recovery. The morning of our departure dawned clear and bright. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the ancient house finally dissipated like morning mist before the sun's warming rays. The November sky stretched blue and infinite above the Sussex Downs, and the copper beeches in the park caught the light with that cold fire which speaks not of heat, but of the crystalline beauty that follows the purging of accumulated darkness. Miss Ashwood walked with us to the circular drive, where our carriage awaited, her step lighter than it had been since our first meeting in Baker Street. The shadows beneath her eyes had begun to fade, and something of youth had returned to her features now that the weight of supernatural dread had been lifted from her shoulders. "You have given me far more than a house, Mr. Holmes," she said, extending her gloved hand in farewell. "You have restored to Ashwood Hall something I feared it had lost forever, the possibility of peace, of rational thought, of a future unmarked by the terrors of the past." Holmes accepted her gratitude with that rare warmth which only genuine distress relieved could kindle in his usually austere nature. "It was never truly lost, Miss Ashwood," he replied gently. "It had merely been obscured, as my own features were temporarily hidden beneath Dr. von Alten's theatrical disguise. Truth has a remarkable persistence. It may be buried, disguised, or temporarily forgotten, but it possesses an inherent tendency to surface when conditions favor its revelation." He paused, gazing back at the ancient facade of Ashwood Hall, where the morning sun struck the leaded windows and transformed them into panels of gold and crystal. "Beware always of those who would offer you supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, particularly when those explanations serve to mask their own, very earthly purposes. The devil, I have found, most commonly appears in the form of men who profit from the fears and superstitions of others. Our train journey back to London provided ample opportunity for reflection upon the curious case we had just concluded. As the Sussex countryside rolled past our compartment windows, fields now bright with winter sunshine, villages sending up thin columns of smoke from their cottage chimneys, churches standing serene in their ancient graveyards, I found myself considering the elaborate lengths to which human greed and desperation would drive otherwise civilized individuals. The theatrical elements were almost admirable in their complexity, I observed to Holmes as we watched a shepherd guiding his flock across a distant hillside. The phosphorescent writing, the narcotic apparatus, even the false hoof-prints, all designed to create a complete illusion of supernatural intervention. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his sharp profile etched against the window glass. "Yet therein lay the weakness of the entire scheme, Watson." Julian Ashwood's very cleverness betrayed him. A genuine supernatural manifestation would require no such elaborate mechanical support. It is only when mortals attempt to counterfeit the miraculous that they find themselves dependent upon india-rubber tubing and silver nitrate. He fell silent for a time, watching the landscape stream past, before continuing in a more philosophical vein. Every age manufactures its own particular species of goblins, my dear fellow. Our medieval ancestors feared demons and witches. We moderns create our terrors from more sophisticated materials. Chemistry, psychology, the very instruments of science, turned to the service of deception. Yet the fundamental human weakness remains unchanged. The preference for dramatic explanations over mundane realities, for supernatural agency over natural causation. Upon our return to the familiar chaos of Baker Street, Holmes arranged the various components of Julian's diabolic apparatus upon our mantelpiece: the hollow brass sleeve, the rubber tubing, the chemical-stained bladder, where they joined the eclectic museum of criminal memorabilia that decorated our lodgings. "Every case leaves its souvenirs," he observed, regarding the collection with the satisfaction of a collector completing a particularly challenging set. "These mechanical devils shall remind us that the most convincing supernatural phenomena often possess entirely natural explanations, provided one possesses the patience to seek them and the wit to recognize them when found." As I settled into my familiar chair by our own honest fire, free from hidden mechanisms and narcotic contrivances, I reflected upon the strange case that had carried us from the fog-bound streets of London to the ancient halls of Sussex. The Devil's Manuscript remained at Ashwood Hall, its supposed curse finally laid to rest, though I suspected the genuine medieval illuminations would continue to attract scholarly attention from researchers whose motives were purely academic. Professor Mortlake had already written to request permission for a proper scholarly examination of the volume, his professional enthusiasm apparently undimmed by his recent exposure to manufactured mysteries. The Reverend Swithin had declared the manuscript cleansed of whatever evil influences had attached themselves to it, while Mrs. Lane had pronounced the library fit once again for its intended purposes. Most gratifying of all was the report we received some weeks later that Mr. Vale, the unfortunate librarian, had made a complete recovery from his narcotic-induced hallucinations and had resumed his duties with renewed appreciation for the genuine scholarly treasures in his care. "The restoration is complete," Holmes observed upon reading this final piece of correspondence. "Ashwood Hall has been returned to its proper function as a seat of learning rather than a stage for elaborate deceptions." As evening settled over London and the familiar sounds of the great city rose from the street below, the clip-clop of handsome horses, the call of late vendors, the distant whistle of trains carrying their passengers to unknown destinations, I found myself grateful once again for Holmes's remarkable to illuminate the darkest corners of human duplicity and restore the light of reason to places where fear and superstition had temporarily triumphed. The devil, as my friend had observed, writes in many hands, but none so clearly as those mortals who seek to profit from the credulity and terror of their fellow beings. In exposing Julian Ashwood's elaborate fraud, Holmes had once again demonstrated that the most pernicious evil often wears the mask of the supernatural, while the most effective exorcism remains the patient application of logic, observation, and that rarest of human qualities, the courage to seek truth wherever it may lead, regardless of how mundane or disappointing that truth may prove to be. Thus ended the affair of the Devil's Manuscript, though I confess, even years later, the memory of that house returns to me at odd hours. The hush of its corridors, the glimmer of false fire upon its pages, and the knowledge that human cunning can dress itself in the robes of the supernatural. Holmes, as ever, dismissed the matter with a cool detachment, yet I knew he had glimpsed how close terror can come to mastering reason. For if superstition rules unchecked, it may bind even the strongest mind in chains of its own making. On the night we returned to Baker Street, he lit his pipe and watched the fog curl against the window. At last he murmured, "Watson, the devil himself has no need of claws when men are willing to sharpen them for him. If this tale captured you, I invite you to subscribe for more untold cases of Sherlock Holmes and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Until the next case, keep your lamp burning and beware the fog."